Greetings and welcome back to Haftarot, the weekly video cast in which we study the week's Haftara read after the Torah reading on Shabbat morning and try to identify the connection between that Haftara and the reading that week. The Haftarah that we read this week in all communities is from the book of Hosea. So I want to give you a little introduction to the book of Hosea. The reason I said that way is because in the Ashkenazi communities, they read from chapter 12 through chapter 13. In our communities, we read from parts of chapter 11 to chapter 12. As a matter of fact, exactly where we leave off is where the Ashkenazim begin. So there seems to be a common theme here about Hosea. So a few words about Hosea. When we talk about prophets, we talk about several different kinds of prophets, several different kinds of Nevi'im. There are Nevi'im who are essentially sent with a specific message to the people, and their job is perhaps to work miracles or to give certain information to the king or to the leaders. And those prophets are not orators, at least not as far as we know. We don't hear their oratory, we don't hear their rhetoric. And then that's like Eliyahu, Elisha, Shmuel. But then there is an era of what we call literary prophets, the Nevi'im, whose words are so well crafted and so beautifully poetic, and the imagery is so powerful that it is the power of their words that's really what they use to convince their audience of whatever they need to convince them of. And the first era of the literary prophets, when you think of literary prophets, think of Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel. The first era of those prophets happened in the 8th century BCE, at a time where the Jewish kingdom was already split into Yehudah and Israel in the north. Israel, which by the end of that century would no longer exist, had gone, as I point out in the note here, had gone to Baal worship, worshiping the ancient Canaanite gods that are called Baal, and that was chiefly because Achav, who was a king in the north in the beginning of the 8th century BCE, at the end of the 9th century BCE, had formed a pact with the Phoenicians and had married a Phoenician princess by the name of Izebel and had brought Baal worship into the kingdom. And as a result of that, the religious standards in the north had really, really dropped as far as their loyalty to Hashem. The second thing that went hand in hand with that was that when they realized that their perennial enemy, the Assyrians, Aram, was a threat, they turned to Egypt and they turned to Assyria for assistance instead of turning to Hashem. And those are the two themes that course through the book of Hosea. So here you have the opening pasuk, tells you when Hosea was a Navi, Hosea ben Be'eri, and there's a list of 4 kings of Yehudah in the times of Yerovam ben Yoash melech Yisrael, essentially the middle of the 8th century BCE. In the second chapter of Hosea, we hear about God's attempt to win the Jewish people back, and the main point that you see here is that they will no longer refer to the Baal as a god. They'll never even call God by the word Baal, but rather Ish. All right, and they will become reinvigorated with that old connection and romance, as it were, with Hashem, just like it was when he took them out of the Midbar. And then we come to the Haftarah. You have to remember, Parashat Vayetze is a single Parashat Mesorah, meaning when you open up a Sefer Torah, you see the words Vayetze Yaakov in Bereshit, the beginning, and you see the end of the Parsha Machanaim, and there are no Parsha breaks in the middle. It's all one story. And it's a story that is Yaakov in exile. It begins with Yaakov leaving home, and it ends with Yaakov returning home. And he went to Haran, he went up to Lavan, and there he married Leah and Rachel, and had 12 out of the 13 children that he'll have that we know of, and had all of his negotiations with Lavan. And it's a powerful story and a powerful narrative about Yaakov's life in exile. And the Haftarah that we read about here is Hosea speaking to the people about their resistance to returning to Hashem. We have to see how this connects with Yaakov's story. And it starts out, Va'amitzlu im meshuvati. which means they're hanging, hanging in the balance. And it seems like they're hanging in the balance between deciding whether or not they want to return. It's that uncertainty which typified the whole connection with the Baal. Should we worship Baal? Should we worship Hashem? Should we worship both of them? And and they are called by the prophets to reach up. El Al, by the way, the airline gets its name from this pasuk. El Al, they're called to look up, but they're not doing it. They're not doing so. So God, at this point, really should destroy them, should be done with them. They have turned their back on God, and time after time He's sent the Nevi'im to them, and they haven't listened. And yet He says, Ech etancha Ephraim, abayancha Yisrael, Ech etancha adma simcha k'tvurim, tapachal alibi yachan nichumai. Essentially, God is saying, how could I do to you what I did to the cities of Sodom and Amorah? Ad Mount Sfoim, destroying them. I can't do that. My heart is too full of love for you. It's a notion that continually shows up in the Nevi'im, famously in Yirmiyahu Lamed Aleph, but in other places. It says, Lo esecharon api. I'm not going to act on my anger. Lo ashuv l'shachet Ephraim. I will not destroy Ephraim, which is the name for the northern kingdom. Ki el anochi v'lo ish. I'm a God. I'm not a person. I can restrain my anger. B'kirbecha kadosh v'lo avon ba'ir. And indeed, what's going to happen? They're going to go into exile, and then Acharei Adonai Yelchu Karyeh Yishag. They will chase after God. Kihu Yishag ve'echardu vanim miyam. God will roar after them, and they will be scared, but they're going to come after God. They're going to come back. Yechardu chatzipor mimitzrayim. Now watch this. They will be afraid like a bird coming out of Egypt, uchuyonah me'eretz Ashur, and like a dove coming out of the land of Assyria. Here we hear the relation, the connection between those two foreign nations that they've been looking to, and where they should be looking to. Voshavtim al batem Adonai. God says, then I'll return them home. Now, further on in this Nevuah, we're not going to read the whole thing, but I want to point you to Pasuk Daled. Here we hear certain verses, the like of which we don't hear anywhere else in prophetic literature, which describe events in Yaakov's life, some of which were in last week's parasha, and some of which will be in next week's parasha, and some of them in this week's parasha. But Beten akavet achiv, in the womb, he held on to the heel, and he ambushed, as it were, his brother. This is Yaakov. Uvo'onos sarat Elohim, and in his strength he challenged God, and that's talking about the wrestling match we read about next week in Parashat Vayishlach. Vayaser malach vayuchal. He was able to stand up to a malach, again the wrestling match. Evidently it means the malach cried and begged him, please let me go. Beit El yimtzaenu v'sham yidaber imanu. And we found him in Beit El. God says, I found him in Beit El. And twice, the beginning of this week's parasha and the middle of next week's parasha, God speaks to Yaakov in Beit El. And all of this tells us what? That God has an abiding love for Yaakov. Look at all the things, people, that Hashem did for your ancestor Yaakov in relationship to his brother, in relationship even to one of my messengers, a malach. He was able to overcome him. Look at all of the good things I've done for you. It's time for you to return. And therefore it says, V'Adonai Elohei Atzvaot Adonai Zichro. He mentions his name and says, V'ata belohecha tashuv. You will return to God. Chesed u'mishpat shemor. You will keep chesed u'mishpat. V'kaveh Elohecha tamid. And always hope towards God. As opposed to the Canaanim, who are deceptive. You're going to be just, right? And this is sort of the theme of the Haftara, which picks up on the story of Yaakov's life as being a model of the way that God shows his deferential love for the people, and then raises hands in puzzlement and in frustration. Why don't they understand that and return to me and stay loyal to me? And that is a theme that courses through Hosea, and hopefully we have a better understanding not only of the Haftara, but of its relationship to this week's parasha. Shabbat Shalom.